Immigrant integration is the social, political, and economic inclusion of immigrants into society. And so immigrants often face a number of barriers to integration. When they arrive in a host country, for instance, whether or not they can speak the language makes a big difference in terms of their ability to integrate. So you can actually imagine arriving, not speaking the language, and it would be really difficult to find a job, to access healthcare services, or even just to talk with your child's teacher. And so communities and governments actually recognize that immigrants face these types of barriers, and they often create policies and programs to help immigrants navigate their new home. However, in other instances, governments and communities might actually implement policies that try to block immigrants from economic, social, and political opportunities. And so these types of barriers can create a whole host of problems, from poverty and the marginalization of immigrant families, which really is economically wasteful, but it can also undermine democracy and social cohesion as well. I think one of the important parts about immigrant integration is that immigrants don't have to abandon their culture, customs, or language in order to integrate. For instance, in the United States and Europe, there are many immigrants who are bilingual, still speak both the language of their home country and their new host country, and they're able to navigate the social, economic, and political systems very well. We also have examples of immigrants living in what are called enclaves. And these are areas in which you have immigrants all from the same part of the world living in close proximity to each other in almost a parallel society. And they don't have much contact with the rest of the host country. And so ultimately, immigrant integration is a dual process. It's both about immigrants and the community building or overcoming barriers together to facilitate the inclusion of immigrants.
The Immigration Integration Policy Lab at Stanford University improves the lives of immigrants, citizens, and our communities through rigorous research. We are a team of interdisciplinary researchers that use large-scale data sets and advanced statistical methods and randomized experiments to evaluate the impact of immigration policies and programs in the United States and Europe to figure out what works and what doesn't. Immigration is increasingly producing some of the most urgent and fundamental challenges of our time, but policymakers and advocacy groups are often too wrapped up in ideological debates about this sensitive issue that they tend to forget to test the effectiveness of these programs and policies. And so the largely unanswered research question is this: what can governments actually do to successfully promote the integration of immigrants? And this is where the Immigration Lab comes in. Our hub of researchers partners with community-based organizations, local, state, and federal governments to implement studies that put these policies and programs to the test, to see which of these programs succeed, which fail, which backfire, for whom and why. And this is important because these programs and policies affect millions of immigrants, and they're also important because they affect the economic and social prosperity of the countries in which these immigrants now reside. And so we try to get this knowledge, this reliable evidence, into the policy discourse to help the design of better policies on the immigration issue for the future. Discrimination refers to the unequal treatment of a person based on their characteristics such as gender, immigrant status, sexuality, or race, rather than their individual merit. So for example, if you have two equally qualified applicants for a particular job, if one of the applicants is rejected because that applicant is an immigrant, we would consider that an example of discrimination. Systematic discrimination is when this type of discrimination becomes structural, meaning it becomes embedded in the behavior and the routine behavior of institutions and organizations. So for example, if in a country the majority of employers would reject equally qualified applicants because they're immigrants, that would be considered systematic discrimination. Detecting systematic discrimination is not always easy. You really have to demonstrate that these applicants, say, are equally qualified and that they are rejected because they're, say, immigrants or because they're, say, female or have a certain religion. And that is not always easy to do. But there are some creative ways of doing this. So for example, what we can do is we can use what's called a randomized correspondence test. So some of our lab-affiliated researchers recently conducted a study in France where they sent out applications to hundreds of French employers. And these applications were identical in the CVs that were submitted, but there was one crucial difference. And employers were randomly assigned to see one version versus the other. In one version, the researchers used a Christian-sounding name. In the other version, the researchers used a Muslim-sounding name. And then they saw and checked to what degree are employers likely to call back to these applicants to inquire about whether they would be good candidates for the job. And in this figure here, you see the main results of the study. What the researchers found was that quite strikingly, for the Christian-sounding name, they received a positive response about 21% of the time, while the Muslim-sounding name received a positive response only 8% of the time. So they were 2.5 times less likely to receive a positive response. And this suggests that Muslim immigrants in France really face serious barriers to economic integration. And identifying these barriers is obviously an important first step towards working towards resolving these systematic barriers, which is what the Immigration Lab is working on.
There is an enormous amount of diversity in terms of the type of immigrants that are coming to Europe. And so researchers often divide migration into 4 different categories. There's economic migration, there's education-based migration, there's family reunification, and there's refugee migration. And so in 2013 in Europe, they issued almost 2.5 million residence permits. Of those residence permits, 30% were for family reunification, 25% for work, and almost 20% for education-based migration. Additionally, in 2014, there were 630,000 asylum applications in Europe. That's the highest number since 1992. And that really is a function of the fact that you have a lot of violent conflict going on in the Middle East. And so you've seen a spike in terms of the number of refugees trying to find a new home and safety in Europe. And so in terms of the overall population of immigrants that are living in Europe, your largest groups come from Turkey, Morocco, India, and China. But in terms of the precise mix, that really depends on which country you're talking about. So for instance, in Germany, the largest group of non-European immigrants are from Turkey. However, in the United Kingdom, the largest group is from India. So there are clear differences in terms of where immigrants are coming from. And so proximity matters. So in Europe, the largest immigrant population is from Turkey, whereas in the United States, the immigrant population is really dominated by immigrants from Mexico, who made up almost 25% of the 40 million immigrants living in the United States. And so that's a major difference. And one of the things that sort of varies between the United States and Europe is the country of origin, where immigrants are coming from. And because of that diversity, one of the things that the Immigration Lab focuses on is how governments and communities can actually create policies and programs that can help immigrants integrate into society who have different cultural and religious backgrounds.